Furthermore, according to Oxford Languages, abolishing is formally putting an end to a practice or an institution. Lastly, according to Oxford Languages, should is defined as an obligation, duty, or correctness. We stand on the side of the affirmative. Today we will discuss that the death penalty should be abolished because the death penalty is inhumane, the death penalty causes a burden to taxpayers, and the death penalty does not deter crime. As affirmative, we must call for the removal of the death penalty because it is unjust. The death penalty in the United States is inhumane because it uses inhumane methods for executions that disproportionately affect minorities. With the removal of the death penalty, the inhumane deaths of minority deaths would end. My team and I would like to offer a resolution to the death penalty, something that would keep death row inmates alive and secure in a prison designed for their own. This would eliminate unjust death, a burden to our taxpayers, and the solution would deter crime. Continuation 1 is inhumane. The death penalty is inhumane because they use inhumane methods that disproportionately attack Black and Hispanics. To start off, the death penalty wasn't always what it is today. Methods of the death penalty have ranged from firing squad, hanging, the electric chair, and more commonly used today, lethal injection. According to the 8th Amendment in the United States Bill of Rights, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment be inflicted. The death penalty today goes against the United States Bill of Rights. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, it is estimated that 3% of the United States executions from 1890 through 2010 were botched. My team and I would like to offer the following definition for botched. Botched means that the methods that were used during an execution were faulty and the person suffered inhumane amounts of pain. Moreover, the death penalty is also inhumane because it disproportionately affects minorities. According to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, Black and Hispanic people represent 31% of the population, but 53% of Black and Hispanics are on death row. To further break down that 53%, 41% of the inmates on death row are Black. Given that statistic, you can argue that the death penalty is and has always been inhumane by inflicting excessive torture and killing minorities. Continuation 2 is that the death penalty burdens our taxpayers. To conceptualize this, I will break down the cost of everything that goes into the death penalty. To start off, the legal cost towards the death penalty. For example, most people who are facing the death penalty cannot afford an attorney. Therefore, they are assigned a public defender, which provides free legal help. This free help is free because of our taxpayers. Second, pre-trial cost. Capital cases tend to need experts in forensic evidence, mental health, and any other background information they might need from the defendant. Taxpayers are responsible for paying any pre-trial detention. Third, jury selection. A jury must be thoroughly questioned on their opinions on the death penalty. In addition, juries for capital cases are more costly. Fourth reason, trial. Death penalty trials are lengthy, causing more money to be invested. Fifth reason, incarceration. Most death penalty inmates are in solitary confinement. In prison facilities, solitary confinement requires more security and special accommodations, becoming more costly. Lastly, appeals. Due to the importance of these cases, it is best to avoid mistakes. To prevent mistakes, a death row inmate is entitled to appeals which come out of the taxpayer's pocket. Having broken down all the costs, it is evident that the death penalty will continue to be a burden on taxpayers if it is not eliminated. Continuation 3 is that it does not deter crime. Lastly, and contrary to popular belief, the death penalty does not deter crime. According to international amnesty, scientists agree by an overwhelming majority that the death penalty does not deter crime. Furthermore, according to Amnesty International, it has proven that states without the death penalty have significantly less murder rates. The death penalty will not deter society's crime problem no matter how many deaths occur, because if you're willing to commit a criminal crime, you will continue to do so and not be afraid to do so because of the death penalty. Concluding my statement, life is something that should not be tinkered with. Someone's guilt should be decided in court, and they should be able to live out their punishment in a facility instead of receiving a cruel and unjust death. Just get my time already.
Death penalty, a topic of great controversy and moral complexity, is one that demands very careful consideration. And while its existence may be unsettling, there are compelling reasons as to why, instead of abolishing it, we should actually retain this form of punishment in our justice system. This leads me to my first point, which is the act of abolishing the death penalty and replacing it with life in prison, with or without the possibility of parole, will not deter crime or ensure safety. Before I go any further, it's important to note that the topic of deterrence doesn't just apply to open society, but within prison walls as well. The main argument most capital punishment abolitionists will bring up is that deterrence has no fundamental or foundational grounds to base reasonable connections on. And to an extent that is true. Studies, reports, and correlations have been made, but in truth it all lacks causation. So for now, this aspect of that argument remains theoretical. But like I said, this only concerns the free society. Replacing capital punishment with life in prison sets the notion that punishment is frivolous and limited regardless of the severity of the crime committed. If this were to be accomplished, any violent criminal that gets life imprisonment will have nothing to lose. Life sentences will no longer carry any weight. After receiving the second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, it loses its value, which will prompt more violence to occur. Considering the consequences can't possibly hide. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the federal and state prison mortality study reveals that homicide was the cause of 2% of state and nearly 3% of federal prison deaths. There were 120 homicides of state prisoners during 2018, including homicides committed by other prisoners. Among those homicides, many of the assailants were serving life sentences already. While the death penalty still resided in 1989, a report done by the New York Times on the Commonwealth versus Drews case is a very eerie example of why abolishing capital punishment and utilizing life imprisonment as its successor can backfire, especially when the inmates involved suffer from mental health conflicts. A neo-Nazi, Joseph L. Drews, who had been diagnosed with a personality disorder, was known for manipulative and unstable behavior. Ended up with a life sentence after strangling a gay bus driver who picked Drews up while he was hitchhiking. 20 years later, in 2009, Joseph would gain a second life sentence after being convicted of first-degree murder of a former Catholic priest who was charged with molestation. Scarver versus Litcher, 2005, is another example of life imprisonment failure. Christopher Scarver, the murderer of the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer, was already serving life in prison for another murder before he found out about Dahmer's reason for incarceration and killed him as well. This will be a very common dilemma faced when the death penalty is removed. Life sentences will begin to feel like a slap on the wrist, which, quoting the first assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Troy, will cause inmates to commit murder with impunity because they feel they are not going to be prosecuted. All these cases have something in common: inmates killing other inmates. And whether you are pro or anti-abolishment, the end goal here is the same, and that is to upkeep the safety of all citizens. But you cannot do that by banishing the death penalty and replacing it with life as a consequence. It only shifts the issue to a different group of people, being the inmates, who are still very much citizens of our society. Depending on the jurisdiction and case specifics, life imprisonment can impose a substantial burden on taxpayers, potentially rivaling or surpassing the cost of the death penalty. This is confirmed by Chris Hicks, District Attorney from Washoe County, Nevada. Assuming the death penalty has been abolished, when a criminal is incarcerated and charged with life, without the chance of parole, the same expenses can apply if the inmate chooses to appeal. While they most likely won't get far with the appealing for parole, that doesn't mean taxpayer dollars are utilized any less. If not legal fees, they'll definitely be utilized in an economic aspect. Contrary to popular belief, the death penalty can be more cost-effective than long-term incarceration. The expenses associated with housing, feeding, and providing medical care toward life-sentence prisoners can be detrimental, especially in terms of health care, which, according to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, as prisoners grow older, the cost of their health care goes up, and you, the taxpayers, are going to have to pay the bill. Health care for the older inmates adds up to more than $2 million a year. The taxes pay for hospital staff, equipment, and medical and eye exams for inmates. The Prison Policy Initiative estimates that the cost of the U.S. around $80.7 billion worth of expenses to upkeep prisons and jails. But aside from maintenance, we must also consider the costs associated with special housing units. According to NBC, about 122,840 people in federal and state adult prisons and federal and local jails are placed in restrictive housing, informally known as solitary confinement, for 22 hours or more on a given day in mid-2019. That amounts to about 6% of the total U.S. prison and jail population at the time. For example, according to the Solitary Watch, solitary confinement in California averages taxpayers an additional $175 million a year. Colorado exceeds $20 million. Illinois costs went up to $25 million. So, when it comes to certain economic aspects, implementing the death penalty allows us to allocate resources more efficiently, ensuring that taxpayer money is used judiciously.
Judge, opponents, are you ready? Judge, are you ready? Audience, are you ready? Okay. So you mentioned the deaths of a priest and a bus driver. Obviously, they did have a cruel death. So you believe the death penalty should not be abolished. In retrospect, aren't you becoming what you're fighting against, the cruel death of another human being?
Well, you said that in prisons, okay, Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah. So you think that the death penalty should not abolish. You gave me examples of the priest and the bus driver. They were obviously murdered. So in retrospect, aren't you becoming what you're fighting against, the unjust and cruel death of another human being? So by you proposing that we keep the death penalty, aren't you becoming what you're fighting against?
No, because those inmates who are now in prison and serving life sentences, they went and murdered other people outside prison, and when they came into prison, they murdered again. So without the death penalty and allowing people with life imprisonment to have that succeed death penalty cases or whatever, you're giving people the ability to commit the same crime again. Because this man, Joseph L. Drews, right, he committed a crime, okay? He went to prison, he's serving life, and then he sees a child molester in prison, and he's like, okay, this is triggering, and he kills that person. So what's stopping him from killing another child molester that triggers him in the future? What's stopping him from hurting someone else in the future?
Yeah.
And, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that brings us to the solution that we proposed originally. So we think that the death penalty should be eradicated, and for a solution, they should be placed in a special prison for criminals of a high profile cases. That's our resolution. So I'm just bringing it back to our original point.
Okay. So I have a question for you. So as a pro-abolitionist, do you believe that crime within prisons can be deterred much more efficiently with a life imprisonment sentence or capital punishment?
I believe that they can be, there's different solutions to it. Like I mentioned originally, we'll have a specific, our solution is to
Can we have 30 seconds?
Just tell us when the timer's going. Just tell us when the timer's going.
Oh, you'll know.
Okay.
It's done.
So I think
Sometimes I have to basically click for movie names or something because I don't have access to a statement.
all right, are y'all ready?
10 seconds. Okay, I think we're good.
Perfect. Judge, are you ready? Perfect. Audience? Great. I'm Jacob Freshour. All right, I will start my timer. Contrary to the notion that the death penalty deters crime, research consistently suggests that it does not serve as an effective deterrent. Those who believe that the deterrence justifies the execution of certain offenders bear the burden of providing that the death penalty is a deterrent. The overwhelming conclusion from the years of deterrence studies is that the death penalty is, at best, no more of a deterrent than a sentence of life in prison. States without the death penalty often exhibit lower murder rates, challenging the assumption that capital punishment has a preventive effect. Once in prison, those serving life sentences often settle into a routine and are less of a threat to commit violence than other prisoners. Moreover, most states now have a sentence of life without parole. Prisoners who are given this sentence will never be released. Deterring crime can be solved by isolating the criminal. Murder and criminal acts cannot be committed to anyone but themselves, but the criminals such as self-harm due to solitary confinement. Thus, the safety of a society can be assured without using the death penalty. Abolishing the death penalty provides an opportunity to shift our focus to evidence-based approaches that genuinely address the root causes of criminal behavior and contribute to long-term societal safety. You say solitary confinement is expensive, but the economic burden placed on taxpayers due to the death penalty is not only substantial but also unjustifiable. According to the Louisiana's Public Defender's Office, the state spent $7.7 million on the legal representation of defendants in the death penalty cases just in 2022. That total does not include the cost of prosecutors, judges, and other criminal justice personnel. The state has not carried out an execution in 13 years and has only had one execution in the past 21. State officials have attributed the most recent execution delays to difficulties obtaining the drugs needed for lethal injection and has stopped setting execution dates. Rather than pouring resources into a flawed system, abolishing the death penalty allows for the reallocation of funds to more effective crime prevention and rehabilitation programs. The excessive cost associated with legal proceedings, appeals, and the maintenance of death row facilities can be redirected towards initiatives that address the root causes of crime and promote a more equitable society. The stark racial disparities within the death penalty system are not easily remedied through reforms alone. Despite efforts to address biases, systematic issues persist, resulting in a disproportionate number of Black and Hispanic individuals on death row. Approximately 35% of those executed since 1976 have been Black, even though Blacks constitute only 12% of the population. The odds of receiving a death sentence are nearly 4 times higher if the defendant is Black than if he or she is white. While also people who are convicted of killing white people are 17 times more likely to receive the death penalty than if those killed were Black, a clear indicator of a system set up to protect and serve white interests. These disparities not only highlight the inequity within the justice system, but also underscore the urgent need to eliminate the death penalty, as it perpetuates racial injustice and undermines the fundamental principles of fairness and equal protection under the law. The affirmative team, we rightfully assert that the death penalty is inherently inhumane, as evidenced by historical contemporary execution methods. Despite attempts to refine these methods, the inherent risk of botched execution persists, leading to prolonged and agonizing deaths. The Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, reflects a collective societal understanding that the death penalty is incompatible with evolving standards of decency. Societies take many risks in which innocent lives can be lost. We build bridges, knowing that statistically some workers will be killed during construction. We take great precaution to reduce the number of unintended fatalities, but wrongful executions are a preventable risk. By substituting a sentence of life without parole, we meet society's needs of punishment and protection without running the risk of any faulty and irrevocable punishment. The very nature of taking human life as a form of punishment is ethically unjustifiable, and abolition is the only morally justifiable stance.
Okay, I'm Kelly Fitzgerald. The first thing I want to start off is the evidence on deterrence from committing murders like this. From committing murder because of death penalty. It's actually somewhat inconclusive. There's one study in 2007 that suggests there were 71 fewer murders, whereas 26, and then in 1979 and 2004, it expressed that there was actually 26 more murders. And this is all over overall in the United States. So I say rebuttal because the death penalty is not necessarily a deterrent. There are multiple reasons why the death penalty is just. The first reason I want to point out is only 2% of the... Sorry, I just want to make sure I have the right statistic. I'm so sorry. There's only about 2% of people that have been committed to death row that have committed serious, heinous murders. The cost of these people on death row is between $60,000 and $70,000 per year. There's never been anybody put on death row for over 20 years. In solitary confinement, which is something that you have mentioned about, these inmates that have committed these heinous acts being in their own separate prisons, that administrative cost is going to be $70,000 to $77,000 a year. So right away, that's a jump from $7,000 more a year. Then you have to look at the amount of people that are in prison. The cost of an elderly inmate costs $2 million on taxpayers per year, just because they've been there for so long and they need health care. If you get the chance to roll, it'll most likely in 30 years, meaning the total spent for the solitary confinement that you were talking about will be approximately $2 million to $2.3 million. This comes to the administrative segregation unit. And utilizing the capital punishment, Chris Hicks, who's a district attorney in Washoe County in Nevada, and he's an active prosecutor who believes in the death penalty. He was being interviewed on KTVN 2 News. Hicks is asked why he believes in the death penalty, to which he replies, whenever you're discussing the death penalty, it's very important to start with 2 topics. One is just how sparingly and judiciously the prosecutors use it. This is for the worst of the worst crimes. We're not just somebody who accidentally shot somebody, obviously not an accident, but manslaughter, their gun goes off. We're not using them for the death penalty. We're talking about people that have just done the worst acts. 2 of the death penalty cases that he discusses, one of them includes a violent rape of a 20-year-old woman repeatedly, and then 2 weeks later, this same man raped a 16-year-old, stabbed her 40 times, nearly decapitated it, and left her in her mother's apartment for her to find. A second case included an abduction of 2 university students who were also violently raped. He then made a 3rd abduction, killed her, and left her lifeless naked body in a vacant field. And the 3rd case we want to talk about is the Tamir Himlin case. The man who was beaten so badly that he was unrecognizable. The death penalty is sought for these 3 cases. I think that it's very safe to say that these people are not safe to be in the world. These people are not safe to other inmates. Another point that I want to talk about that you guys say is the inhumane and the unjust. Absolutely, there have been cases of not being able to, of wrongful conviction. So there are definitely things that we would like to implement for that. DNA testing. All interviews, of course, should be maintained and watched. And the state established a special fund to provide more money for both public defenders and prosecutors. And in this, this is looking to make sure that every single case that's on there is completely clear and just. The same attorney, Chris Hicks, that we were talking about, also mentions that, I'm so sorry, also mentions that the prosecutors looked at these things so closely they make sure that it's the right defendant. He talks about one case that was appealed and appealed and appealed 3 to 4 different times. After everything has been completely looked at, and the evidence is completely there 100% of the time, then it's absolutely just. And lastly, he reiterates that you have to think of the victims' families. Yes, it might not bring back their lost loved ones, but there has to be justice for these people. I also want to talk about the cost of life in prison. From a woman comes the New York Times about how families cope with hidden costs of incarceration for the holidays. A woman named Talita Hayes, she adds nearly $200 to her commissary account for ex-husband. On top of that, $1,600 she puts in the commissary each year. She pays an additional $4,000 charges for talking on the phone, $419 for emails, and this is 2.3 million people behind bars. So if you think of the cost not only on their families, but on taxpayers as well, the longer and longer that they're in there, the more and more it costs money. And in terms of cost, the last thing that I want to say about that is there are so few people on death row. While it may technically, in some cases, be a little bit more expensive when we're talking about prosecution, there's so few many that it doesn't actually lead up to the cost of what life in prison would be. That's it. Oh yeah, the crossfire, dang. Okay. Are you ready for the crossfire?
Yeah, are you ready, Judge?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I believe you said in your speech that no one was ever held on death row for more than 20 years, but there is a case actually in 2018 of Kerry Dean Moore. He was in death sentence for like 38 years. He was on death row. He got caught in the 80s and he did not get killed until 2018 of August 14th.
Okay, I did not know that. You mentioned sorry, I had it written down here. You mentioned a lot about the deterrence, and I'm kind of wondering where you're finding like your information on deterrence, because everything that we found was pretty inconclusive on that.
Do you know, like, could you describe which part I was talking about?
Specifically, just that it just doesn't deter more murders. Right, the penalty doesn't deter more murders, and I'm wondering which statistics or information that you got that from, because everything that we found was inconclusive, or a lot of it was like Gallup polls.
I mean, it's just like, in the past, like 20 years, the fact that there have been less death penalties, more people have been in prison. Yes, they're killing more people in prison, but that's what we're talking about. We're saying that prisoners are going to be in solitary confinement. They're not going to just be like let out again in prison, or they're not going to be with other people and kill more people.
I will say that that'll be just as expensive, if not more, than just the death penalty.
But it's not. The state of Louisiana spent $7 million on lethal injections, and they only had one execution. It was $7 million.
Well, I think that it comes of someone ordering wrong. If there's only one person, they shouldn't have that much medicine on there. Or not medicine, but
That's
lethal injection. I guess I just don't see...
That's time. Thank you.
Opponents, are you ready? Judge, are you ready? Opponents, are you ready? Judge, are you ready? Audience, are you ready? Okay, my name is Ashton Cotton. I'll be starting my time right now. The death penalty continues to put a restriction on the rightful law that humans have to live. Up until this point, you have been informed about the disadvantages of taxpayers, the inhumane treatment of criminals, along with the segregation of different races that are being attacked. Arguing that abolishing the death penalty will release some financial stress on U.S. taxpayers, while also reforming the conviction of blacks and Hispanics, has been one of our main focuses thus far. According to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, black and Hispanics represent 31% of the population, but 53% of blacks and Hispanics are on death row. By breaking down these unethical exertions, we use the 8th Amendment to provide reasonings of inhumane punishment placed on people of death row. The 8th Amendment argues and prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, which contradicts the tradition of death row cases taking place. Taking someone's life should only be decided by a higher power of religion or by natural causes. According to the DPIC, there are 5 forms of execution that have been issued since 1976. Those include lethal injection, electrocution, lethal gas, hanging, and fire squad. Not only does this country believe in taking a life, but they use harsh and brutal tactics in doing so, which blindly contradicts the 8th Amendment. The goal and moral understanding doesn't revolve around the ending of flawed justice system, but about redirecting, reframing our focus towards evidence-based approaches and moralized criminal punishment. Economically, it costs more to take a life through death row than it is for housing a criminal in prison on a life sentence. Physically, it is inhumane to take life generally and especially through the conditions that we have set as a country. Morally, we are not providing justice by punishing a crime with another crime. Two wrongs does not make a right, and two executions should not be labeled as correct justice. Yes, there are extreme cases where conversation may be contradicted regarding serial killers and A-list criminals. Nevertheless, the solution is simply stated. As the affirmative side, we support our reasoning behind a solution that can eliminate the death penalty in its entirety. In the prison system, there are different levels of incarceration. Depending on the crime you commit, sometimes determine which prison facility you are sent to. Some of the world's most highly known criminals have been sent to places like the Pentagon. The Pentagon serves as the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. I propose the abolishment of the penalty, which would economically save our country billions, if not trillions. Taxpayers would see a substantially decrease in the amount they pay, and those finances can go towards building a new prison for the incarceration of potential death row inmates. There have been approximately 3,539 men and 54 women placed on death row since 2000, which is 23 years in total. According to the DPIC, to build a prison that holds 4,000 to 6,000 inmates, which is about 6 inmates shy of what we've logistically accumulated, costs between 400 and 750 million. And according to the Nevada legislative state records, it costs 137 million to annually withhold the death penalty and 232.7 million annually to present a system that has reformed the process of fairness conviction. If we eliminate the death row in its entirety and focus on reforming and creating another form of system for the death row inmates, we can create a death row prison. Economically, this solution saves us trillions while still bringing justice to those who have been wronged by criminals. The U.S. can lead by example and rightfully promote the Justice and Greatest Free Country campaign that we have been advocating since our forefathers. That's my time.
Okay, so my name is Caitlin Arredondo. We, the negative team, believe that the death penalty should not be abolished and should be kept as a form of punishment in our justice system. Our first speaker spoke to you about the act of abolishing the death penalty and replacing it with life in prison, or without the possibility of parole. This will not deter crime or ensure safety. If deterrence were to be true, then criminals would no longer have anything to lose because they have been sentenced to life sentences on top of life sentences. The additional weight has no effect. Our second speaker spoke to you about the inconclusive evidence on deterrence. There has not been found enough evidence to prove that the death penalty is a deterrent to committing murder or not. States that have the death penalty laws do not have lower crime rates or murder rates than states without such laws. And states that have abolished the capital punishment show no significant changes in either crime or murder rates. The state established a special fund to provide more money to both public defenders and prosecutors for hiring more attorneys and investigators and to pay for more through investigations. Our first speaker also spoke to you about the excessive financial burden of life in prison. The death penalty can be more cost-effective than long-term incarceration. There are also expenses associated with housing, feeding, and medical care. It is proven that as prisoners grow older, the cost of health care goes up, adding up to $2 million a year, and this money comes from taxpayers' pockets. Our second speaker also spoke to you about each person on death row and how they're entitled to an appeal. Most prisoners do not have the finances to appeal, causing this financial burden to fall on taxpayers, as every citizen is entitled to legal representation. The state established a special fund where families are also responsible for paying court fees, reinstitution, and fines when a member goes to prison, according to a 2015 report by Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. The average family paid roughly $13,000 in fines and fees. One second. So even if you were to argue on the behalf of rehabilitation in order to deter crime, there are still several factors you have to consider. Inmates facing life imprisonment may see little incentive to participate in rehabilitation programs or conform to prison rules, as the prospect of parole or release it is not applicable to them. An article written by Prison Journalism Project, a platform that aims to establish a nationwide network of incarcerated journalists to address the lack of information about the prison system and provide first-hand clarity on mass incarceration. The author's name is Jeffrey Shockley, and he states 10 different ways prisons fail to rehabilitate, and there's the following three are related to long-term imprisonment. One is limited opportunities. Individuals serving long-term or life sentences may be passed up for rehabilitation programs, and they're further limiting their opportunities for personal growth and transformation. The second one is inaccessible programs for long-term inmates. Programs that could potentially lead to sentence reduction are often difficult for long-term inmates to access. Some programs may be reserved for those near their release date, limiting their availability to individuals serving lengthy sentences. And the third one is the perception of inmates with long sentences. These policies within the U.S. correction system, particularly for individuals with long sentences, convey a sense of disregard for their value and potential for change. The author in this suggests that in the United States, there is a long way to go to establish a truly rehabilitative system. And these are just a few of some of the shortcomings in the current U.S. correction systems when it comes to rehabilitating individuals.
Is this crossfire 3 minutes?
Okay.
Can we get-
3 minutes, not 2.
wait, are you asking
Opponents, are you ready? Judge, are you ready? Audience, are you ready? Okay, so I know that you guys were discussing that the death penalty stops crime completely. I'm asking you, Ms. Kelly, can you give me a specific example in which the death penalty completely stopped crime?
Not that it completely stopped crime, but it stopped the people that were killed from committing more murders. Absolutely.
That
Especially the case of, where was it? Sorry, I have it written over here. The case with the 20-year-old girl and then the 16-year-old. I mean, how many more women would he have done this to? And these are like something so heinous. I mean, he almost cut her head off and left her for her mother to find. I mean, if anyone deserves a death penalty, it's absolutely this guy, and that stopped him from committing any other crimes again. Not crime completely, of course not, but definitely for this guy.
Okay.
I had a question for Ashton. You said something about that by abolishing the death penalty, we were going to save taxpayers billions, if not trillions, and I'm trying to figure out where that number is coming from.
Okay, yes.
Because that just seems more like theoretical than statistical.
Well, statistically speaking, from the legislative state of Nevada, we have logistics that an average inmate or average incarceration facility holds about 4,000 people, 6,000 people. The people that have been convicted of the death row has only been shyly of 4,000 people. So that means that to uphold a prison costs $232.7 million annually. To withstand that prison, to have failed trial dates, that is another 137 million annually, which average 400 to 750 million. So those were the logistics are coming from.
Okay.
So
That's far from a billion and trillion, that's all. Okay.
well, I mean, that's 1 year. So if you multiply that by 23 years from 2000, that will equal the billions and trillions that I'm talking about. And then I do have a question for you guys. You say that it costs up to $2 million for an elderly inmates with the cost of health services, but that still outweighs the logistics and burden that the death penalty has on our taxpayers. For instance, the legislator states of Nevada says it costs $1.26 million for an inmate to be prosecuted through death row, but it only $740,000 for an inmate to be withheld in incarceration through the end of their term, which doesn't account for the millions that we spend on trial, the millions that we spend on money that we are using to convict the inmate. So what is your reasoning, or what is your purpose of having this logistics if it doesn't outweigh or it doesn't support you guys' ruling?
I would say that
It's time.
You could still answer it. Oh, you good. You could still answer it.
okay, so when I said that it costs $2 million per year for an elderly inmate, I'm talking about one. And as we've stated before, there's more than one elderly inmate in prison right now. So
Especially if there's more and more people in life, we're gonna have more and more elderly people.
yeah, so that will add up.
I guess that kind of proves our point that it is really expensive, so it should be abolished. So,
Well, if they're
We're talking
in-
about people, life in prison.
Yeah, life in
It's
prison.
really expensive.
okay, at the death penalty.
Yeah.
Notice, are you ready? Judge, are you ready? Audience, are you ready? Okay. My name is Chaka. Ladies and gentlemen, today we find ourselves at a pivotal moment in our judicial discourse. A moment demanding a profound examination of whether the death penalty should persist in our society. Our argument, meticulously crafted around the pillars of inhumanity, racial disparities, and exorbitant economic costs, seeks not only to challenge the status quo, but to advocate for a systemic reform that aligns with the principles of justice, fairness, and humanity. The inhumanity inherent in the death penalty is not merely an artifact of history. It persists as a contemporary reality that we cannot afford to ignore. We've traversed the historical evolution of execution methods, from firing squads and hanging to the modern-day lethal injection. Yet, despite these transformations, the haunting specter of botched executions looms large. The Eighth Amendment of our Constitution explicitly prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and we believe that the death penalty, with its documented instances of pain and suffering, stands in the direct violation of this constitutional mandate. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, on October 19, 2017, in Alabama, Tory McNabb's lethal injection took 35 minutes to end Mr. McNabb's life. McNabb's attorney said that his movements during the middle of his execution, which included moving his arm and rolling his head back and forth after a consciousness check, showed problems with the sedative used by the state. McNabb's family members and attorney who witnessed the execution expressed concerns to each other that he was still conscious during the lethal injection. He's going to wake up, one of his relatives whispered. Judge, we do not have the right to bring insufferable pain to any human, no matter what the reason. Delving into the racial disparities ingrained within the death penalty system reveals a disconcerting truth that demands our immediate attention. Shockingly, 53% of individuals on death row are Black or Hispanic, significantly surpassing their 31% representation in the general population. According to the Pew Research Center, a staggering 56% of Americans believe that the death penalty is more likely to be imposed on a Black person than on a white person committing a similar crime. This is not merely a flaw in the criminal justice system, it is a stark manifestation of systemic injustice. The urgency to address these disparities is clear, and our call for abolition represents a crucial step towards rectifying these deep-rooted inequalities. Economically, the death penalty exacts an untenable toll on taxpayers. We have meticulously dissected the costs associated with the death penalty. Legal fees, pretrial expenses, jury selection, trial costs, incarceration, and appeals. These costs accumulate to a figure significantly higher than alternative sentences. The elongated process from sentencing to execution, which according to Pew Research has more than tripled from 1984 to 2019, is not just a bureaucratical hindrance. It is a FICO drain. In California, more death row inmates succumb to natural causes or suicide than face execution. This protracted timeline underscores the inefficiency of the system. Redirecting these financial resources to crime prevention and rehabilitation programs isn't just a FICO responsibility, but a moral imperative. Considering the heartbreaking case of Gail Lasure, whose daughter, Monique, was murdered in Colorado in 2000, yet the killer was never found. In Colorado alone, there are 1,200 unsolved murder cases. Families like Gail's have launched a campaign to end the death penalty, advocating for the redirection of savings to fund cold case units to find those who have perpetrated heinous crimes. According to the Equal Justice USA, Gail wisely asserts, "I would rather have a large number of people caught than a few executed. Judge, our tax dollars should be harnessed to build a safer and more just society, and not wasted on a system that perpetuates capital punishment." The argument suggesting that the death penalty serves as a deterrent to crime is contradicted by substantial evidence. Scientific consensus, as presented by Amnesty International, firmly rejects that notion to the death penalty contributes to societal safety. Judge, as we navigate the complex terrain of the death penalty debate, we must confront crucial questions. Are we willing to accept the inherent flaws and risks associated with the death penalty, especially considering its disproportionate impact on minorities, communities? Can we justify the exorbitant economic costs when alternative sentences offer more cost-effective and morally sound solutions? The abolition of the death penalty is not merely a policy proposal. It represents a commitment to justice, equity, and a more humane society. It is a call to redefine our values, reassess our priorities, and forge a path toward a criminal justice system that reflects the principles we hold dear. Thank you.
You ready? Y'all ready? My name is Trey Bernard. Here. Despite the numbers, studies have been made that indicate racial bias in the application of the death penalty in various jurisdictions. Research has shown that factors such as the race of the victim and the race of the defendant can influence the likelihood of receiving the death penalty. Here are some of our main focuses repeated. As an example, a man named Christopher Scarver killed Jeffrey Dahmer in prison while Scarver was already serving life in prison. Scarver had nothing to lose. He heard about Dahmer's crimes and felt the need to take justice into his own hands. As he was already serving life, he had no initiative, so he just chose to murder. Here are multiple cases and other studies I am restating from my partner's speeches so it can stick through your head why the death penalty shall stand. The act of abolishing the death penalty and replacing it with life in prison with or without the possibility of parole will not deter crime or ensure safety. Before I go any further, it is important to note that the topic of deterrence doesn't just apply to open society, but within the prison walls as well. The main argument most capital punishment abolitionists will bring up is that deterrence has no foundational grounds to base reasonable connections on. And to an extent, that is true. Again, life in prison will be an enormous financial burden on taxpayers. Assuming the death penalty has been abolished, when a criminal is incarcerated and charged with life without the possibility of parole, the same expenses can apply if the inmate chooses to appeal. Both the death penalty and somebody with life in prison have the chance to appeal. That's why I bring that up. While they most likely won't get far with the appealing for parole, that doesn't mean that taxpayers' dollars are utilized any less. along with the fact that taxpayers also have to pay for all of the other expenses, another claim is that replacing capital punishment with life in prison isn't an equal form of punishment. For example, if a man who is serving a life sentence kills again in prison, which is going back to the Jeffrey Dahmer case, do you agree with the fact that he should just go to the hole, which is basically just more punishment, and he just sits by himself and he gets 1 hour out? Because we don't think that the death penalty, we think that the death penalty should definitely be a factor, but there should be stricter rules on whether you should get into the death penalty or you shouldn't. One study from Wardy Adler and Michael Sumners in the article Capital Punishment Works, written in 2007, suggests that there are 71 fewer murders each year. An execution took place in the years 1979 to 2004, which is a 26-year span. It is no surprise that our justice system is flawed and is a flaw and is filled with loopholes. The reforms we listed have been in place for years now. But there are times where bias, carelessness, and really just general disregard for life has gotten the better judgment. According to Mr. Hicks of KTVN 2 News, there are such a small group of people on death row, money shall not be a problem because there's such a small group compared to the overall society of the people in prison. You said that there should be, instead of putting people in death row, you should put them in a separate prison for their crimes, but that already exists. It's called Alcatraz, if you didn't know about that. But statistically speaking, Americans' moral stance towards the death penalty in 2023, according to Statista, reveals that 60% of the U.S. population believe that capital punishment is morally acceptable. 34% believe that it is morally wrong. 4% believe that it depends on the situation, and 2% has no opinion. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, upon your case on Mr. Moore, a federal appellate court reversed his death sentence, and sent his case back for resentencing, which cost him 8 more years, meaning that he only had 12 years on death row. You use the fact that color has something to do with this, and overall it does, but right now, currently, on death row, 42% of people are white and 41% are black. Your first speaker stated that 53% of people on death row are people of color, but people of color include 8 different races and ethnic groups, and white is just one race. So your argument is out the window. $750 million a year, which your third speaker said, is spent on death row. But 67% dollars per year is spent on the number of people in prison, which does not include people on death row. You have keen insight and ideas on why abolishing the death penalty shall stand. We also believe that there should be different aspects, and you should actually have to look into it, but we do not believe that the death penalty shall be abolished. Thank you.